So, Tom, let's get things started today by learning a little bit more about your background. You're currently a professor and you're also a former editor for the Journal of Business Logistics. So, definitely heavy supply chain logistics background. Can you share a little bit more about your career to this point?
Well, certainly, I'll start from the present time. As you point out, I am a professor of supply chain management at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I also serve as the Dean and Jimmy Haslam Chair in Logistics, and so that explains my supply chain heritage is kind of the moving and shaking side of supply chain and logistics. And also serve as the co-executive director of our Global Supply Chain Institute at UT, which is kind of our think tank body that connects what we do on campus with all the great stuff taking place off campus and around the world in supply chain. With regard to my very beginnings, I was an economics and finance undergrad at the University of Evansville. I'm a Hoosier native, ran track and cross country for the Purple Aces some decades ago. And I was intent on maybe having a career in finance. However, it was when I took a job with the Valvoline Oil Company in Lexington, Kentucky, where I worked in their logistics organization, primarily with outbound distribution, that I really fell in love with logistics and transportation in particular. And so at that time, I really pivoted more toward applying my economics and finance background to the action of business, as I refer to it, and logistics in particular, and got my MBA at the University of Kentucky, and then later my PhD at Michigan State University in logistics. And I've been a professor since I graduated from Michigan State back in 1998. So I'm going into my 27th year now of being a professor. And I'm pretty unapologetic about it. I think it's the best gig going. I just love the freedom to be able to research and teach the subjects that I'm so passionate about, and then to share that passion with the next generation of supply chain leaders.
Well, it was funny. I was thinking about that as you were saying, you sort of intended a career in finance, ended up through different steps in supply chain logistics. Little did you know, all these years later, I mean, it is the rock star field, isn't it? Especially these days.
I think of it as the rock star
I do
field. And in
too.
fact, I was just in front of my undergraduate intro to supply chain class on campus right before coming on camera with you. And I was teaching, if you can believe it, over 700 undergraduates that are
Wow.
wondering, what in the world is this thing of supply chain management? And I expressed to them, it's the action of business.
Yeah.
It's where strategy, really meets the road. It's where things get executed. And as you indicate, though, I didn't take a supply chain class until I started working on my PhD at Michigan State. Like so many of us in this field, it is a field that found me
Yeah.
rather than me going out and seeking it.
Now, one of the other things that I'm sort of curious about, I sort of straddle the worlds of procurement and supply chain. And so I'm regularly sort of talking about where do you leave one and go to the other. I've always thought of procurement and supply chain as cousins. But since we're really diving down deep into supply chain and we've talked about transportation and logistics, even in our first couple of minutes together, how do you typically define the scope of what you consider either logistics or transportation within the larger field of supply chain?
Well, you're right. Supply chain management is a many splendored thing, whether you come to it from the procurement field, manufacturing, service operations, or logistics like myself. You do have that heritage, right? How we kind of plug in. Very few of us are going to enter the field as a vice president of
Mhm.
supply chain or chief supply chain officer. You're going to tend to come up through one of those functions and develop expertise. And then maybe over time, you gain a rotation and some greater appreciation for those key interfaces. With regard to my background in logistics, again, it was dumb luck for me. Good fortune maybe is a better way to express it, that I went into a logistics organization. And like I said, just became enamored with transportation. I have to admit, I like, um, to travel. I don't necessarily like to be confined to an office. I like to be out there and
Yeah.
abound in the world. And I found that transportation, both domestic and international, was really alluring to me. And with regard to the broader scope of where logistics fits, it is the physical connection. Through most supply chains, we have stuff that is flowing. We have inventory whether it's raw materials, work in process, finished goods, returned merchandise, what have you, that stuff is moving, and the management of that inventory throughout the system is the transportation logistics element. And again, just as I was enamored with it more than 30 years ago when I was introduced to it, I'm still just as passionate as you can probably tell in my voice.
Well, and I think we're going to put all of your travel time and all of your think tank time to the test today, because we're going to take on not only a massive topic within business and supply chain, but one that touches on geopolitics and government policy and all of these different things that we're so focused on. And that is X-shoring. Now, just to clarify, and we're going to dig into this, X-shoring is not buying things from the company formerly known as Twitter and importing them into the United States, right? Sort of a fill in the blank there. Give us some examples. What are the most common types of X-shoring that we mean when we talk about this practice?
Certainly. And by the way, your X reference there is just comical. I think people probably picked up my chuckle as you described that. But as you point out, the letter X is just a placeholder. So whether we're talking about reshoring, nearshoring, there's something called friendshoring taking place now. It's recognizing that our supply chains do stretch around the world, and absolutely they are subject to international intrigue. And I'll have to admit, that's something that I find really fascinating as well. And it's the outcome of the past 3 to 4 decades in which globalization has really taken flight. Just earlier this morning, I was sharing with my students, it's like, during pandemic, we came to appreciate, everyone came to appreciate that our supply chains, don't begin at some domestic location and then end at the supermarket. Where we conveniently walk in and grab items and fill up our shopping cart. One, because we weren't filling up our shopping cart in the throes of pandemic, and that 95% in-stock performance that we expect at the grocery store was far short of that. And so a lot more questions were being asked. Where does this stuff come from? And we realized, well, manufacturers don't snap their fingers and have the inputs magically appear. And there's an example that I've been using in class for many years called the example of the granola bar. Think about a pretty simple granola bar, a simple grocery product that has just a handful of ingredients, right? You've probably got some grains and some sugars and some spices and maybe a chocolate chip or two.
I was going to say, I'm going to need chocolate chips to get the full meaning of the lesson. Okay, good. Chocolate chips.
In there. And don't forget the packaging, whether it's the foil packaging as well as the outer packaging. And I asked the students, where do you think this stuff comes from? And while we might determine that maybe a General Mills factory in Minnesota is making the granola bar, we start to map the sources of those ingredients. And we realize we've got to go pretty far and wide, well beyond the borders of the United States to get those chocolate chips, maybe to get some of those spices, maybe to get the petroleum that then goes into the packaging that makes that plastic packaging. And pretty soon, students start to realize, wow, this is a simple product, and yet the supply chain is so complex. And it's not just students in supply chain management and supply chain pros out there that are coming to grips with those complexities, the realities of our global supply chains. Everyday people, regulators, public officials, everyone has come to grips with this notion of the end-to-end supply chain and its inherent complexities.
Now, if we think about all of those different types of X-shoring, and especially if we think back to 2020, when a lot of this was the subject of discussion, where would you say we are on that journey to change the overall geographical footprint of our supply chains?
I would say that, again, there's that first dawning of realization that we rely on these disparate sources of supply for everyday ingredients, as well as some fairly complex ingredients. Think semiconductors, if you want to think of that as an ingredient.
Sure,
Goes into anything with an on-off switch is going to have some semiconductor. And I think that we've come to grips with the extended nature of our supply chains. A lot of questions about how we got here. I alluded to 3 to 4 decades in the making to make it happen. And then the question, well, what do we do about it? And the simple knee-jerk reaction is, well, let's reshore. Let's double down and try to secure those sources of supply, points of production, and make them here in the United States. And I mentioned semiconductors, and absolutely, we're trying to do that as a nation, but it's a national effort, right? Because we're talking about pouring tens of billions of dollars into efforts to not be so dependent on, say, Taiwan or China for those critical inputs. And so that takes a lot of money, a lot of courage, a lot of gumption, if you will, to do that and to kind of reverse course.
Yeah.
And I think it's a little quixotic to people because they think of Intel as a US-based company, and we are designing those chips stateside, and yet they may not be produced stateside. And why is that? Because if you look at the raw materials, you look at the fabrication capacity, that's not necessarily here in the US of A. And that's, again, pretty complex products in the form of semiconductors. And some people might say, well, we ran out of face mask. We didn't have face mask early in the pandemic. And yeah, it wasn't a matter of just snapping your fingers and having those things magically appear. And yes, we were largely relying on international sources, namely China. And inevitably, we're going to be talking a lot about China in the course of this discussion.
Yeah.
And that is the common low-cost country source for so many household items, everyday use items, and increasingly not so everyday items. And so we're getting those questions that are being asked about where does stuff come from and why does it come from a domestic source? And again, 3 to 4 decades in the making, we're not going to just readily reverse course in a matter of months or even years. I mean, this is a decades in the making sort of effort. So that's where we see maybe the reshoring of a lot of activities. Again, takes a lot of gumption, a lot of finance to make that happen. Perhaps nearshoring is something. Maybe we can still enjoy some low-cost country sourcing from our dear old neighbor to the south, Mexico, which has become our primary trading partner as of this year, has surpassed China. And so we are looking to more and more operations relocating back to Mexico. After they were there, mind you, 25 years ago, we had maquiladora operations where Mexican low-cost country sourcing wasn't cheap enough, and it went overseas to Asia, namely China. Some of that is coming back to the region. And then also I used the term friendshoring earlier, which is to say, maybe we can't bring it back into our hemisphere. Maybe there's natural resource limitations. The materials simply are not found in the US or nearby, but maybe there's a friendly nation, say Australia, where we might be able to source these raw materials and perhaps even produce products, even though it's still a long ways from the US shoreline. We have confidence that we're going to remain very friendly with those nations, hence friendshoring, sometimes referred to as ally shoring. And there's a lot of talk about that into the future too.
Now, so much of that talk, and this is where I start to worry, sort of looking at these trends, is back at the beginning where they started. Now, you use the word knee jerk, which I think is a great word choice. And mentally, I am right there with you. Because when you think about why you carry out any business strategy, especially when it's as expensive and involved and as complicated as something like moving where you produce or moving where you source from, you have to be doing it with the right level of forethought and preparedness and understanding about the ROI and trade-offs. When all of this talk about X-shoring really started to pick up, do you think it was a carefully considered choice given all of the different motivating factors? Or was there some level of emotion, especially if we think back to those days, okay, we can't get PPE and they come from China and everybody's having a bit of a panic. Was there sort of an emotional driver to some of these conversations that hasn't necessarily stood the test of time the same way that companies or industries looking at thoughtfully nearshoring or moving production have maybe been able to get a little bit more traction under their plans?
Well, Kelly, I think you've offered a great summation, and I would agree wholeheartedly that there's been a lot of emotion around the talk. I think the rationality is around the action. That's when things get to be more studied. And you have to recognize also that the fundamental economics have not changed, right? China remains a low-cost country source. It's not as low cost as it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Labor wage rates have increased. The cost of doing business have increased. Yes, we have tariffs as well that we'll probably touch on. There's the onus that those might increase and spread even further in the coming months. But the fundamental economics have not changed immensely. And I think we've got to kind of go back to, say, the late 80s, early 1990s, and certainly into the early 2000s when China joined the World Trade Organization. That's when, China said, we want to be a part of the developed world, and we want to be the supermarket to the world for any and everything you might be able to imagine. And so many companies took them up on it. And dare I say, it was large US monolithic companies. I won't name names here, but you can imagine who they were in manufacturing and retail, who brought forward what was said to be the most vaunted words in all of business in the early 1990s, the China price. And if you can't deliver that China price, you better figure out how you're going to do it. Are you going to take it on margin? Are you going to take it in service provision? If you can't match that, and as soon as one company went over there, hey, that was the feld swoop. I mean, everyone had to follow. And so the vigor with which companies left to go to the Far East and pursue that low-cost country sourcing has certainly not been reversed. And that's why it is largely emotional. It's largely talk. We do have the benefit of having more advanced understanding of supply chain management, things like total cost of ownership, which my friends, my supply management friends in my department would be, are giving golf applause right now somewhere hearing this, but absolutely total cost, landed cost, total cost of ownership. We have a much better grasp of that. In fact, Kelly, I remember a survey that I saw a consulting organization ask in the late 1990s, ask companies that had offshore their operations, are you glad you did it? And I think something like 75% of companies in the late 1990s said, not so sure we would have done that. They didn't look before they leapt, right? They were put in that competitive situation where a very demanding customer is saying, you better figure out how to match that price that, dare I say, others in your category are looking to China. Right. And they're figuring out how to devise quality that meets our standards, and they're building capacity and establish footprints over there. So I'm not saying you got to go there, but you better figure out how you're going to match that price. And so while the economics are closing, certainly the cost gaps are closing, it does lead folks to say, okay, maybe China's not where we put all our eggs. Certainly the tariffs that came about during the Trump administration led folks to think about China +1. Yep. So maybe a little bit of diversification. Maybe most folks look to Vietnam, continue to look to Vietnam. Others look to Thailand, other Southeast Asian locations, perhaps India or Bangladesh, depending upon what they're sourcing or making. But I think that's where we are. I think where we are is that companies are realizing strategic decision makers have better information now to understand landed cost to landed cost, total cost of ownership to total cost of ownership. And also there, dare I say, maybe some more options that are on the table. And also those options are being forced by virtue of the artificialities of tariffs and geopolitics. And things that just basically make us uncomfortable about maybe doubling down in a location. But in terms of saying we're going to leave China, that's grossly overstated and exaggerated. The notion of bringing those operations back home. Hey, there have been some high-profile cases where, hey, we're going to reshore, and now it's crickets, right? That's right. Yeah. Hearing about computers and some of these things that were big splash reshoring efforts, maybe on a very selective basis.
Yeah. The devil's still in the details, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, when we talk about costs, an enormous motivating factor to manufacture or source in China or even all of Southeast Asia, frankly, is the cost of labor. And so, as we here in the Western world start to look at, the robots are coming to save us, and we think about the impact that automation can potentially have on what would have been a labor cost in manufacturing, this is probably another one of those areas where the jury is still a little bit out. I'm curious about your perspective on how successful the effort to replace human labor with automation and robotic labor has been so far, and how successful that's even been in terms of a finished product.
Yeah, I don't know that we're seeing replacement per se. I don't think the technology is there to supplant or replace human labor for the most part. What we are
Yeah.
finding is more of a marriage of human labor with automation. And one example that I like to point to, it was an interesting experiment that a couple of big athletic footwear makers made a few years ago. Nike and Adidas decided, hey, why don't we try to produce shoes where we sell them? We do sell some shoes in Asia, but
Sure.
virtually all shoes are made in Vietnam, China, and Korea. Why don't we bring that automation? Why don't we create some automation that would allow shoes to be made in Germany and the United States? And Adidas had something called a super factory based just outside Atlanta. And the premise was, we're going to make a different kind of shoe, one that doesn't have quite as much stitching, quite as many seams, not quite as many materials. And we think that automation will allow for that. And what's interesting is we might even be able to customize shoes to meet
Mm,
customers' interest, do it close to market where the customers are, and deliver a customized shoe in a short amount of time. Well, that experiment ran short. I think they shut those down a few years ago. Nike was doing the same sort of thing, I think, in their basement at Beaverton headquarters. They were trying to make these simpler shoes.
yeah.
And I'll have to admit, I had an opportunity to test some of those shoes, and they didn't really conform to my foot. It was just a very straight last. They had
Okay.
a curvature to the foot. And, take a look at your foot. It's got a lot of curves to it. A straight shoe just doesn't really accommodate. It's because they were trying to do it in a highly automated way. And
Mm,
both of those companies ended up pulling stakes and walking away from that and say it was an idea a little ahead of its time. And I think that so many industries find themselves there. And what we have is kind of this bifurcation of manufacturers, those that still have very high touch manufacturing operations and those that have relatively low touch operations. And if you're in a low touch operation where automation is meeting the needs, dare I say, manufacturing a vehicle, dare I
right.
say, manufacturing an electric vehicle in the future, we may not need quite as many hands to do that, in which case we can make those investments in technology and to do that basically around the world and produce in these locations where the customers reside.
Yeah.
Machines cost about the same in the United States as they do in China, Thailand, Europe, what have you, wherever you're interested. But we're just not seeing technology for those high touch products. It's just not quite there. And we're seeing the same thing in distribution as well. There was some suggestion that we're going to go to, fully autonomous warehouses. And really what we're seeing is that blend again of human labor and technology that's making the human labor much more productive, efficient, safer. And I think those are all good things.
Well, and it's interesting too, because we sort of opened today talking about where supply chains is where business becomes action, right? That's where the stuff really happens. And you hooked me at chocolate chips, but you've totally got me one over on shoes, Tom. Because when I think about the different ways you can manage these challenges, right? So you talked about like, let's go full automated. All right, well, we tried it, and you need people to do that. So thank goodness people are willing to try those things.
Mhm.
But then I also think about I'm in the Northeast, so I'm New Balance country, right? There's also LL Beans, not all that far from me. That's a pleasant half day drive up to Maine. They took sort of a different approach. They said, these models of shoes, right? They are made in the United States. They are priced accordingly, which is sort of a different approach. And I think LL Bean took it even one step further, and they said, these are small batch made in Maine. And you open the box. Spoiler alert, I had to get a pair. It was business research, right?
Of
You
course.
open the box and it says, oh, this pair of boots was made for you by Lorraine or Stephen or whoever made it. And so it sort of factors into the customer experience. But it's so interesting to me. I love to see all these different businesses experimenting with different ways to handle the supply chain challenges, but then pressure test consumer responses. So where is that breaking point around what people will pay to have something made in the US, but that's automated in your quality expectations versus something that's positioned as a premium product and made in the United States or made in your own local community? And it's so interesting as we start to see these intersections between how do we manage the supply chain and then how do we manage the costs and make sure that we're still profitable as a business. You can really see how quickly this comes back overall to how everything's managed.
Absolutely. And I think in some instances, you're going to find companies that are going whole hog or wholehearted toward
Yep.
pursuit of that belief that customers are out there and they're willing to pay that premium, which inevitably we're going to find if you're going to try to domestically source,
Yeah.
domestically produce, there's going to be a measure of premium associated with that. And again, as you describe a great customer experience, it suggests that those LL Bean items of apparel and the New Balance footwear and so forth is merited.
Yeah.
Where we're seeing another approach is to say, okay, a segment or a portion of our business will try to do that. And we're seeing that really happen in the sustainability space. There's the belief that maybe not everyone is what is referred to as an evergreen and willing
Okay.
to pay that premium in order to feel better about the products and be a full participant in, say, closed loop supply chains. But there's some portion or segment of consumers that are perhaps willing to do that. And I think businesses are saying, well, we should at least make an effort, even if we're not going completely in that direction.
Yeah.
We should make an effort. We should learn fast. We should try to get these economics together, hopefully to a point where we can still make money in that segment, recognizing that it is growing. And also, there's the onus of regulations in the future that might kind of force us down that path. So we really better get ahead of it. So as you were kind of describing the reshoring or maintaining that domestic presence, I think we're finding another similar experience right now with sustainability. And something that, frankly, I get very excited about is trying to figure out ways that we don't sacrifice. In logistics and
Yeah.
supply chain in general, we generally speak of trade-offs. In order to achieve great service, it costs more.
That's right. Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I'm an advocate of lean thinking, even though it's got raked over the coals, and just in time in particular has certainly gotten beaten up over the last 4 years, which could be a subject for another podcast, frankly, Kelly, as I try to defend lean thinking. But what I really love to share with people is that there's the prophecy of right? That I love finding those innovations where we enhance service and we reduce cost. Now, can we do the same thing if we introduce sustainability concerns? Is there the way that we can provide great products and services that customers clamor for at affordable prices,
Yeah.
and we reduce carbon footprint, we reduce emissions, we are a great member of the community and society? Those are the things I get really excited about. And when I kind of impart that to students, I see them say, yeah, can we be a part of the solution where we don't have that inherent trade-off. We can achieve simultaneous benefits across the stakeholders.
Now, it's interesting that you bring in that point of view and what portion of the consumer base is going to be influenced. I mean, and it could be by anything. How sustainable is it? Where is it produced?
Mhm.
How specialized is it? We often see companies and therefore their supply chains responding to trends that seem to be impacting consumer choices. But consumers aren't necessarily consistent, right? They can also easily pick up on a trend relatively short term. How can decision makers, supply chain managers look at some of these trends and figure out, to your point, do we turn the entire production over to this or do we segment off a piece? Is this going to be a long-term trend, something we should actually restructure to accommodate? Or is this going to be something of a flash in the kind of a short-term trend? Any advice that you have for figuring out the difference between what's going to be lasting and what the business should change around versus what's going to be short term and needs to be evaluated and accommodated, but not necessarily committed to in the same way?
Sure. My thought is to go back to something we were talking about in great depth every industry meeting I went to pre-COVID, going back 2017, 18, 19. We were talking about big data
Yep.
and analytics, right? And getting smarter. And I think that's what we need to kind of go back to. We need to try to understand what makes you, Kelly, what makes you tick versus what makes me tick. And also, I'll go a step further. The way I behave in one transaction circumstance is not the way I'm going to behave even when
That's
I'm
true.
buying that same item, right? I tend to be a last minute type of person. And, I'm that person that's like, oh, golly, there's an anniversary, there's a birthday, and I'm hustling and I'm paying the premium for
Yeah.
the expedited transportation and say, hey, you're telling me it'll get there in 36 hours, right?
And
But
please let
meanwhile,
it get there. Yeah.
I don't want it to be late, but I didn't really think or act ahead. But meanwhile, the next time I'm making a purchase, I'm not so rushed. I'm not so eager to maybe pay that premium. And that's where, as we talk about trends, that's me as an individual changing how I behave, maybe purchasing the same item from the same vendor, just from one instance to the next. And that's where I think businesses in total have to break the mold. We're certainly kind of breaking the mold of the one size fits all, but even going further, to look at what a customer's looking for in a given transaction, a
Yeah.
given instance, and try to understand and to the extent possible, predict where I'm going. I think that's really in the analytics. And I know that we start to get into a lot of uncomfortable issues around privacy and, online vendors seeing what I'm clicking on and, trying to anticipate maybe where I'm going next, if I'm putting that item in the shopping cart or not, and so forth. I think there's some issues we've still got to resolve there in terms of real-time dynamic analytics. But I think in terms of just understanding, hey, where are we more often going to win rather than lose? What if I were forced to make a call on Tom making this purchase of this item in this instance, which way do I think he's going to go? And so there's a lot of talk, and certainly AI inherently is going to be
Absolutely.
factored in there, machine learning tools, and that's really kind of the outgrowth of the big data analytics that we were talking about, 5-6 years ago. Now it's, Gen AI and really trying to project into that predictive realm. And I think that's where businesses need to just get smarter and being more in the moment with the customer in that moment.
And it's interesting too, because as much as the analytics are complicated, but they're there and there's huge opportunity, especially for large consumer facing and especially publicly traded companies, there are all of these other pressures on them as well. So for instance, there's the federal government and how they will at times either throw their weight around through tariffs and trade policy or through spending. What are some of the ways that you're seeing? And we've talked about a lot of different industries today, manufacturing, but specifically EVs and semiconductors. How are you seeing federal funds impact private sector decisions around where they produce and source?
Well, again, our hands were placed on the stoves during pandemic. We learned it hurt when we weren't able to get what we wanted when we wanted. And that raised the concerns about specific sectors. Certainly semiconductors, and the CHIPS Act came about, in fairly quick order on a bilateral basis to say, hey, we need to get these cars off the assembly lines to where they're not waiting for these electronic components because we don't have the semiconductors. We also don't want to be dependent on these external sources. Again, where geopolitics introduces itself. And so, semiconductors and the CHIPS Act is one example. We also saw the bilateral infrastructure bill, which is key to getting things to into country, out of country, moved about the country. And major investments are taking place. Hence, all those orange barrels that you're running into, those Tennessee orange barrels that you're seeing throughout the Northeast and around the country. But I do think that electric vehicles is maybe one of the most compelling case studies that's in front of us right now. And certainly, the Inflation Reduction Act had a lot of provisions in place to say, let's make sure we produce those EVs in the United States. But even more than that, let's produce those batteries in the United States, which that is the key technology, is the battery. And I'm really anxiously watching this competition for the dominant design of the EV battery and which ingredients we're going to take to market. I don't know if there's going to be a singular design, because it seems like if you're okay with a battery that can hold a smaller charge and hence have a shorter range and shorter life, that's one technology. And then there's apparently what the American consumer is most concerned about is the long range, big charge, as if every day we're going to hop in our car and drive, 1,000 miles or something. But I think we're going to see, I use the term bifurcation. I think we're going to see the splitting of the market in this way too, as it relates to that technology. But regardless of whether we're talking short range or long range, there's interest in trying to develop that technology here and have those minerals sourced either in the United States, nearby, and particularly with a friendly country. And what we're looking at are multi-billion-dollar startups, right? All the big automakers are placing their bets. Some are really gung-ho. It made news last week when Ford was perhaps more gung-ho than anybody. And then they said, the market's not quite moving as fast as we expected. Adoption's low. There's range anxiety. We're building up inventory of these cars. They're not moving. And I would argue that's what you're going to get when the U.S. average price for a gallon of gas is $3.35. If it gets to $5, $6, which it probably will inevitably, there's going to be a lot more interest in hybrids and EVs.
Well, and the other thing that I feel like we need to touch upon, where all automotive, but certainly EVs as well, is the relative influence we've seen in the last couple of years of labor unions. We saw some very high profile contract renegotiations, and not just within automotive, right? We saw a lot going on with the Teamsters and UPS. But if we keep focusing on labor as one of the key cost drivers, whether it's being assisted by automation or not, it's interesting that labor unions have been such a loud part of the conversation over the last couple of years. How are you seeing their voice and their relative influence change some of these supply chain strategies?
No, you're right. Last summer of 23 was the summer of strikes.
It was crazy.
Toward the late summer, the UAW strike, which again hit what we used to call the big three, Detroit-based automakers. And the way they approached it, I have to admit, as a strategist, it wasn't as if there was the walkout on one day. It was the rollouts.
That's right.
And it was particularly impactful, I thought. When we're talking about an industry like automotive that Peter Drucker referred to as the industry of industries, right? You can kind of say the health of the U.S. economy is very closely tied to the health of our domestic automakers. They're just so pervasive because it's not just the OEMs, the big automakers, but it's that supply base that follows them wherever they go. And there's an interesting split here again between the US-based automakers that are unionized and those so-called transplants, as we used to refer to them, right? First it was Japanese, it was Honda and Toyota, and then increasingly Kia and Hyundai from Korea, and then also the European automakers that also came. And the UAW hasn't really been able to make inroads, although just down the road, they just unionized Volkswagen in Chattanooga. So maybe the tide is turning. And I think that's related to the great success that the UAW had last year. And whether it's the UAW in automotive or it's, the Teamsters with UPS, they made incredible achievement, if you will, in wages and benefits. And dare I say that I think the unspoken that didn't get a lot of attention during those talks, particularly for manufacturers, was what's the future of the auto laborer in producing cars? And I got to believe that even though we got, our eyes were popping at the wage increases and the benefits and so forth, I really took note of what role will we have in EVs when, frankly, producing an EV is a lot more plug and play. It's like, I'm going to oversimplify, but it's a lot more like playing with Legos than it is Tinker Toys.
And I do think it's been documented that EVs take less people to build, right? To your point about data and analytics.
Yeah, it's much more modular. I mean, in a conventional car, you're talking about 1,600 parts and components coming from 300 different vendors. And when you're talking about propulsion, and that battery, that's where it all rests in the EV. So you're talking far simpler product, something that's more akin to a golf cart, if you will, than a race car, and far fewer moving parts. And you don't need as many hands-on wrenches, frankly, to make it happen. So I think that was kind of the big long-term play that I think labor was saying, hey, these are good wages and you're protecting a certain number of workers here for the next contract term, but what about, future generations of auto workers? And I think that's a little more speculative, frankly.
Yeah. Now, as we start to think forward and maybe, before we dismiss class here, I'm interested in the lessons you think we should be taking from the last few years. I mean, they've been hard. We've had some stressful years. There's been some reactionary things, right? We talked about sort of the visceral emotional response to I'm going to XShore everything in the world, to the realization, oh my gosh, that's really hard and super expensive. Maybe we should think about this, right? To some of these things where you also have companies very carefully and methodically experimenting with different techniques and approaches to try to hold leading positions or gain leading positions if they don't have them today. What takeaways would you suggest, or maybe even what are some forward-looking things that you'd like to leave anybody that listened to our conversation today or watched it to walk away with?
Kelly, if I can bring Art of Supply listeners into the classroom one more time, I would assign them a project that I always assign in my supply chain classes, which is to map the supply chain. Understand where your stuff comes from. Also look downstream, understand where it's going, understand what role you play in that interwoven network that is the supply chain. And I've been issuing this assignment for the better part of 20 years now. And I love for students, first of all, I tell them, focus on a simple product because like that granola bar, it's going to get complex really quickly. So you'd be wise to keep it pretty simple. But map it as far upstream as you can. Go all the way to raw material extraction if you can. Also take it downstream. If you rely on intermediaries, distributors, retailers to reach your end use market, map downstream as well. What I'm really pleased to tell you is that every time my students have an opportunity to present their supply chain map back to the focal company, that they are mapping a simple product, those business professionals with that company have learned something about their supply chain that they did not know before my students were there projecting it on the big screen and maybe shining a light perhaps into some dark corners that they just hadn't ventured into. All right. Did you realize that tier 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this is going on? Did you realize that you've got a redundancy here, or you've got a point of vulnerability there that maybe is a cause of concern? The reason you're getting a shortage is because there's a much bigger company in another industry that's buying from that company, and they're usurping all that supply. And that's why you're left with allocation and high prices and spotty availability. And so it's really been rewarding for me as a professor for my students to illuminate those things. But I think that supply chain pros need to do the same thing. And yes, you're not going to be limited to just your simple products. You need to understand the full product line, understand where you have points of vulnerability, yes, but also points of opportunity as well. Sometimes by virtue of understanding that end-to-end supply chain, you realize, oh, I see that maybe we're buying from the same vendor at tier 3 that our competitors are, and maybe we're not getting that availability. Maybe we're not getting that pricing. Maybe there's something really exciting in the way of intellectual property there. What if we were to take a stake in that?
Yeah.
And so sometimes you can see these maps serving not only as ways to shore up the vulnerabilities, but also to shine a light on some promising avenues for growth. And that's really invigorating. And I think, again, just this understanding and appreciation for the end-to-end chain is kind of where we are, but being empowered to do something about it, not just to take it as given and, oh, shucks, maybe times will improve. Maybe they'll get a new leader. Maybe we'll, no, try to do something about it is what I encourage folks to do.
Well, I love that suggestion. I love the fact that you're doing that with your students now, and that presenting it back to the company that should presumably be expert in their own supply chain. They still have an opportunity to learn things. I think that's both the benefit of getting down to the fundamentals and also the benefit of fresh eyes. So please tell your students to study as hard as they possibly can, because we need them, whether they end up having careers in supply chain or not. I think the more professionals that understand the complexities and opportunities of the supply chain, the better for all companies and industries. And Tom, I appreciate you spending this time with us today. If people are meeting you for the first time through this conversation, what would be the best way for them to reach out to you and to connect?
Certainly, they can find me at LinkedIn is probably a great way to connect with me. I'm Thomas Goldsby on LinkedIn. And then they can also reach me via email at tgoldsby, that's TGOLDSBY, at utk.edu. And I'd love to hear from your listeners and maybe take the conversation a little bit further.
Awesome. Tom, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Kelly. It's great to be on The Art of Supply.